Hi, everybody. Welcome back to your second week of criminal justice and pop culture. I know that we've started with some historical films. We will be moving into more present day issues, I promise. But it is important to understand history and context before we start looking at contemporary pop culture. So this week, another film from the 60s, 1963, To Kill a Mockingbird. The book came out in 1960, and we're really dealing with issues that permeated the criminal justice system all the way up until that point. You've already read, hopefully, the material on the Scottsboro Boys, watched the documentary. So a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about in this module are really centered on 1930s, 1940s America, as well as the civil rights movement. We will talk about race in the criminal justice system again next week when we do part 2, and that's where we will move into more modern conceptions of race and popular culture. So for those of you that are going, oh my gosh, I just want to get to the today stuff, I promise we will get there. Just hang in there with me. So obviously, To Kill a Mockingbird was originally written as a novel that was then adapted to the screen to be a film. And it was written by Harper Lee. And there are some really interesting parallels about Harper Lee's life and what she puts into To Kill a Mockingbird, particularly Scout, the lead young lady with the father of Atticus. So Harper Lee was born in Monroeville, Alabama. Scout was born in Macomb, which is a made-up place in Alabama, and both growing up in the 1930s, both with fathers who were lawyers, and even their names are similar. And so I'm going to argue that a lot of the conception of To Kill a Mockingbird is based on Harper Lee's own life and own perceptions of growing up in Alabama during the trial of the Scottsboro Boys. And I think that's really the trial that she's talking about in this film. There's a lot of allegory to the Scottsboro Boys trial and all of the subsequent issues. And this film is really a vehicle for talking about race and the criminal justice system. So I hope you enjoyed watching the film. I have struggled with it more recently, even if we just, we leave out the later Harper Lee book, we just look at To Kill a Mockingbird. I have struggled with some of the characters a little bit as I got older, so I will be curious if you are as well. So like I said, Macomb is a fictional city in Alabama, but for our purposes, we're going to use Monroeville as an allegory. Small town Alabama, this is where Harper Lee was from originally, and this is where the attitudes and the perception of the South really gets centered. And so we're looking at the time period of 1933 to 1935. And although we've long abolished slavery, we've gone through the Civil War, the Southerners in Macomb very clearly continue to believe in white supremacy, as did most Southerners in the 1930s in the United States. One of the neat things about the timing of the release of the film is that whites were again grappling with the place of Blacks in New America in 1963 during the peak of the civil rights tension. We had seen sit-ins and we were coming up to see Freedom Summer, and there was a lot of tension and angst about where everybody was going to fit in this new America. And we can certainly see some parallels to Inherit the Wind, right? This tension between what has been and what is going to be, traditionalism and modernity creeping in, and understanding where everyone is going to fit. And certainly when the film came out, there was a lot of tension about whether or not segregation was still appropriate and what the United States was going to look like, particularly in the South going forward. So in the civil rights era, as in the 1930s, Black Americans were really living in a world of discrimination. And this is one of my favorite pictures that I really think shows the depth to that discrimination is the different doors, right? So many people will be familiar with segregation in the South, having to ride on different parts of the bus, drink from different water fountains, go to different schools. But even stores would have different entrances. You didn't touch the entrance, you don't do anything to the entrance. The fact that they wouldn't even let colored Americans or Black Americans go through the same door just shows the depth of this view, this pervasive sentiment that Blacks and colored people were somehow subhuman, were lesser. And they used a terminology that was deliberately done as a mechanism of othering. And I just still, every time I look at this picture, I get angry at the idea that this was somehow okay, right? That America was fine with this. And this is something that I think shows, because this is 1940, so this is after When to Kill a Mockingbird is set. And this would have still been in place when Harper Lee was writing To Kill a Mockingbird. So it shows how lengthy and pervasive and just all-encompassing this discrimination was. So here are some other examples right from Alabama. Brown v. Board of Education ruled that schools should be integrated, that is to say they should be desegregated in the late 1950s, and that wasn't fully implemented until much later. But during the time of To Kill a Mockingbird, we had school segregation, separate schools for white students and what they called colored students. I'm trying to use the terms of the actual era when I'm referring to that era. But it was as far and pervasive as separate waiting rooms, separate theaters. You had to have separate passenger cars in some instances. Interracial marriages were not acceptable or legal at all until Loving v. Virginia in some states, as well as the role for nurses and doctors was even different. In Alabama, you couldn't have a white female nurse in a hospital that treated Black men because there was this pervasive myth about the, what I call bestial Black man, or the idea that even ill Black men were somehow this grave threat to white women, and that they were these dangerous predators, always lurking to take advantage of a situation. And this was popularized in the media, and this is really even how we see Tom Robinson portrayed in the film, although he's the exact opposite, and that's done deliberately. But it shows the extent of legal segregation in Alabama during this time period. So aside from legal segregation, what else do we have going on in the 1930s that affects our setting? The biggest thing is the Great Depression. So the Great Depression sweeps the nation in the beginning of the 1930s, right after the stock market crash of 1929. And many families, Black families, white families, and everybody of high economic status previously and low economic status are not getting their basic needs met once the stock market crashes. This includes things like food, clothing, and shelter. You had all of a sudden, in the span of 6 months, 6 million people unemployed, vast increases in homelessness and food insecurity. And in Alabama, in a state that was already fairly poor, income for families is about $125 to $250 a year. So that would be roughly $5,000, just under $5,000 a year in 2019 money. Right? This is the fine that Scopes got in John Scopes in the trial we looked at last week. This is not a living wage. Right? So you can see the depth of the poverty. And the poverty exacerbates racial tensions. Racial tensions were already high, even during good economic times. But when people have less, they view others as more direct competition for those scarce resources. And you see this intense fuel that gets added to simmering racial tensions. And at the time, many Southern Blacks had been living in sharecropping situations. So they had been living on white farms, renting land essentially to farm it. And they weren't slaves, they were making some money, but with the downturn in the economic market, the inability to sell the product, mass amounts of sharecroppers were summarily dismissed or fired, and you have whole family sources of income disappearing. You also have Franklin Roosevelt as president, who's a very progressive president, instituting some New Deal reforms. He's working to help people get back to a better standard of living, but he's not doing a lot on racial inequality and racial tensions. Many of his Democratic colleagues in the House and the Senate are Southern Democrats who at the time still believe very strongly in segregation and white supremacy. And so he's limited if he wants to pass reform for all Americans. That often comes at the expense of being more progressive on civil rights and civil liberties. When we look at some of the things that were going on in the world during the same time period as To Kill a Mockingbird was set, one of the things that often comes up is the rise of Hitler and Hitlerism, fascism in Europe. And so in the 1930s, Hitler is the Chancellor of Germany, and Germany hosts the Summer Olympics in 1936, which very famously are attended by Jesse Owens, who's Black. And Hitler has very strong white supremacist views. He not only believes that Aryans are superior to Jews, but also to Blacks, and believes that his Aryan athletes will be, have absolute supremacy in his Olympic Games. But this isn't true. We know that Jesse Owens wins several gold medals, and one of the events where he wins a gold medal is the long jump. And he beats a German competitor named Luz Long. And Luz and Jesse become lifelong friends, which shows that not everybody believed in Hitler's maniacal white supremacy. There were many Germans who did not attempt to defend or support the regime. And it shows the depth of this friendship that when Long was killed fighting for Germany, fighting for Hitler's view of the world in World War II, Jesse Owens went back to Germany after his friend had died, and paid his respects to him after the war had ended. So there's a picture of them in the bottom right-hand corner. But one of the other things that I think is really important to think about is the role of the juxtaposition and role of the United States during this time period. So there's two Jesse Owens quotes I included here. When I came back after all these stories about Hitler and his snub, I came back to my native country and I couldn't ride in the front of the bus. I had to go to the back door. I couldn't live where I wanted. Now what's the difference? And the other quote that I like of Jesse Owens, although I wasn't invited to shake hands with Hitler, I wasn't invited to the White House to shake hands with the president either. So it shows the depth of the view of white supremacy in the United States. Now, certainly nobody in the United States at a presidential or congressional level was talking about the lengths that Hitler went to exterminate broad sections of humanity. But the deep-rooted sentiment of difference, of superiority, of this moral outrage that somehow Black people could dare think that they were equal to white people, that was pervasive. And it wasn't just pervasive in Europe. And so I think it's really important to realize that, Jesse Owens, this phenomenal Olympic athlete, goes and shows Hitler, screw you, right? Black men are just as good and they're just as phenomenal athletes. And he comes home, nobody really cares, right? He doesn't get the same respect, or nothing changes. He still has to sit at the back of the bus, use a separate water fountain. And I think that dichotomy speaks a lot about the time period and what's being displayed in the film. Some of the key themes that we're going to be talking about this week, obviously racial prejudice and the lengths historically that it existed, but also morality in conceptions of rightness and wrongness, equality, what true equality means, the need for compassion and understanding and true empathy. But I also want to talk about the conception of lawyers as heroes, right? Is Atticus Finch a hero? What do we understand by the term hero? Who do we view heroes? And then talking a little bit about the white savior narrative, which is often a problem in film. It's continued to be a problem in film throughout modern times. I think we can explain it a little better in this film because it's based on true events to some degree, but I still want to draw some attention to it. So think about these themes as we go through. Okay, so some key details about the Scottsboro Boys and subsequent trials. We start in March in 1931 in a Southern Railroad train station at Paint Rock, Alabama. Now, the police had been notified about white women and black men riding on a train together, and the story quickly emerges that these white women are alleging that they had been raped by 9 black teenagers. These women are Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, and eventually the train stops in Scottsboro and the boys are arrested. Now, this is really sort of monumental for a few reasons. The first is that during the 1930s, lynching was exceptionally common in the South for crimes against black men, whether proven or not, mostly, in fact, unproven. And the fact that this actually made it to a trial, that you had the sheriff of the county essentially keep the lynch mob at bay to go through the legal process is something that was exceptional. And it's sad to set such a low bar for expectations, but without that, there's a lot of jurisprudence and law that we would have never gotten. And it's rare for a few other reasons, in that the 2 women, again, Great Depression era women, had previously been involved in the sex industry. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that they couldn't have been raped. We know that sex workers are raped at a much higher rate than other women, but it means that because sex work was looked down upon during the time, that their status as white women would have been lessened in some ways than other white women. They would have been seen very similar to the way the Yules are seen, to be perfectly honest, to make that parallel with To Kill a Mockingbird. And they were not treated particularly well. And it is likely that Victoria and Ruby made up the allegations of rape in order to justify the fact that they were on a train with black men to begin with. This was something exceptionally unbecoming of women in the 1930s, and would have led to very severe consequences for those women. Within the Scottsboro Boys, the oldest was 19, the youngest was 12. A few of them didn't know each other, and this was a really unfortunate happenstance of circumstance that just brought all of these individuals together. So within 1 month of the first trial, the first person in the trial is sentenced to death. And the jury essentially ignores all the evidence. They wanted execution versus life in prison. The trial is essentially a sham. The defense is done by a real estate lawyer who's never tried a criminal case in his life. It shows you the extent to which justice was being denied to blacks across the South. And this was symptomatic of a much broader, bigger issue, but shows you still the depth of the problem. In reality, none of the Scottsboro Boys were executed, and this is largely because of Judge Horton. The central figure in this case is really Judge Horton. Judge Horton postponed the trials and set aside one of the convictions, which made him incredibly unpopular. And the case makes its way up to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, these boys are sitting in jail. And the U.S. Supreme Court reverses the convictions of the Scottsboro Boys because their constitutional rights had been so obviously violated. There were gross violations of right to counsel by having a real estate lawyer essentially take a death penalty case. So we go through this again, and again, same result, guilty. But the Supreme Court reverses the convictions again. Different legal issue here, and this is something that really sets the standard going forward, was that there were no blacks on the jury in Alabama in the Scottsboro trial, because there were no blacks that were eligible to be on the jury in Alabama. They were only using voting rolls of whites. And so they were deliberately excluding an entire pool of jurors, to which the U.S. Supreme Court found was unconstitutional. And this is the first time that the Supreme Court says that failing to use correct data that could allow for blacks to serve on juries was unconstitutional. And so we finally get this sort of symbolic case, this very important case in Patterson v. Alabama and in Norris v. Alabama, that say blacks' constitutional rights are just as important as whites' constitutional rights, and a failure to respect them is going to lead to new trials. So eventually there is less of an appetite to go through the trials. The public has sort of moved on. This has dragged on for more than 4 years, and 4 of the defendants are freed. The other 5 serve fairly significant prison terms. The last individual to get parole is Patterson in the 1950s, which is 15 years after the trial and 19 years after the event. It shows how it was essentially impossible for blacks to get a fair trial in the South, despite having a famous lawyer, despite having money coming in from the northern states, that this was not justice. This was a really stirring example of a tragedy, an injustice. Now, most of these men have been posthumously pardoned, but I don't know, and symbolically, of course, that's important, but I don't know that there's anything that could have been done or could be done now to right this egregious wrong. So these are the Scottsboro boys standing with Alabama County Sheriff officers on the left and the right, and their attorney sitting down. And I am always astonished by this picture because it shows the reality and the depth of the humanity in this picture. These are children. These were all younger than you, likely. Many of them were illiterate. They had no conception of the gravity of the jeopardy that they were facing or why they were caught up in the system that they were in. And so each of these men really had their life destroyed by these allegations that were made and subsequently recanted by 2 white women that they really didn't know. And it still, to this day, blows my mind how much life can change by a surreptitious set of circumstances. And so in To Kill a Mockingbird, the Scottsboro boys are represented by Tom Robinson. Tom Robinson is a young black man working as a sharecropper on a white farm. He's married, he has 3 children, and by all accounts is a innocent, just, fair man living responsibly, taking care of his family, trying to make a life for himself in the South. He's got a crippled left hand from an accident, and he's falsely accused of raping a Southern white woman, Mayel Ewell, after her father finds out that they had kissed, that she had engaged in the sin of kissing a black man. And so this is really a parallel to all of the Scottsboro defendants. And it shows the depth of the gravity of perception, right? That a white woman would allege rape to save her own reputation, to save her father's reputation, that a white woman could dare see anything in a black man was just abhorrent to that family at the time. Of course, we know what happens to Tom Robinson. He is convicted. He is killed while trying to escape. Atticus has said that, he had hoped that they would win on appeal. Tom, it is clear, does not believe that that is going to happen. And he is the martyr, really, in this film. He is the person that the film features throughout, or the reason that we have the story throughout. But he doesn't have a lot of agency. Everything happens sort of through him or around him, but not really by him. We're going to talk about why that matters in a minute. So one of the key people in this film, the key figures, is Atticus Finch. He is portrayed by Gregory Peck in the film, and he's portrayed as much more moral and virtuous than he is in the book. He is seen to be much more responsible and ethical and more good-hearted in the film. He's quite different from Samuel Leibowitz, the appellate lawyer who works for the Scottsboro Boys and the second trial lawyer, but he's more perhaps in common with Judge Horton in terms of his temperament, his disposition, and the things that he goes through to attempt to ensure a fair trial for Tom Robinson. And now, I said that I've struggled with this film a lot in recent years, and that's partially because I used to see Atticus as sort of this beacon of goodness, right? He takes the trial, he works to save Tom Robinson. He's not successful, but, darned it, he gave it his best shot. I am now more critical of Atticus than I used to be. I'm wondering if you will be able to identify why, and I'm hoping that, this comes out in the discussion posts. Even judging Atticus by his time, I think that he falls short of expectations. And your textbook talks about a lot of the ways in which he could have done a lot more than he did. Right? He could have applied for a change of venue, and he didn't. He didn't jump at the chance to take this case like Samuel Leibowitz does. He doesn't, try and get this case and work on behalf of the enslaved and underserved Black population everywhere. He's reluctant. Like he gets, all right, fine, yeah, okay, I guess I should. Right? He's not this social justice champion. He's not this civil rights warrior. He's this reluctant, sort of uninspiring guy who does a sort of good job defending someone who deserved a lot better. I think they're trying to portray him as sort of a Southern gentleman, sort of a typical Southern gentleman. You're supposed to see him certainly as a soft-spoken, courteous man with good values, and that he's respected, and he's a widower, and he's raising his kids, and all these progressive things. And I think that you're really supposed to see him as brave for taking the case. But I don't think that he's as brave. I don't think that he's as heroic as many people do. Even saying, he lived in the 1930s, and you have to judge people by their limitations of the time. Yeah, to some degree. But I think that we could have expected more out of Atticus. Certainly Judge Horton, at least, was prepared to stick his neck out, much more so than Atticus does in the film. And he doesn't fight the status quo, right? You see all of those Black women and men up in the second gallery because they're not allowed on the first floor. And he doesn't say anything about the rightness or wrongness of that, how people are treated. He just sort of accepts it all. Oh, yeah, well, that's just the way it is, and wouldn't it be great if it was different, but it's not. He doesn't fight for anything. He's not a champion of justice or equality, at least not as I see it anymore. And that's why this film has caused me some more angst and pain watching it, because he's not what I want him to be. Maybe you'll see it differently. You can let me know in the discussion. Now, my change of feeling about this film has not affected my views on Boo Radley. I love Boo Radley as a character very, very much. He's portrayed as this enigma who has been abused and mistreated by his father to a period of what seems to be lifetime confinement because of some mischief he got up to when he was a teenager. And Jem and Scout are in equal parts kind of in awe of and terrified of Boo Radley because of his reputation as being insane, sort of this monster-like creature. But he's this harmless, well-meaning, essentially childlike human who has been starved of love and affection, and he saves Jem and Scout undoubtedly from certain danger. They would have been very gravely injured, if not worse, but for Boo Radley. And what I find to be the most interesting, if we compare, and this is one of the things I'm going to ask you to do, is if we compare the way that Tom Robinson is treated to the way that Boo Radley is treated, particularly at the end of the film when Boo Radley kills Bob Ewell, and we just have a completely different perspective on that. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's right. I want you to think about it, how we feel about Boo Radley and how our feelings for Boo Radley are different, perhaps, or maybe they're the same, for our feelings of Tom Robinson. So the film is called To Kill a Mockingbird. It's named after the book. The mockingbird is a symbol here. It symbolizes everything that's good and pure and harmless in the world, right? Atticus talks to Jem about it being a sin to kill a mockingbird. It's a sin to shoot a mockingbird because a mockingbird sings, it pleases others, it's harmless, they give joy. And it appears 4 times in the novel. We see it a few times in the film as well. And the two people who really are symbolized by the mockingbird, Tom Robinson and Boo Radley. The people in the film capable of joy, of bringing joy, and who are subsequently in different ways robbed of the ability to bring joy, or that we fear are going to be robbed of that ability to bring joy. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your comparisons of those two characters. So I want to finish this module's lecture talking briefly about the white savior complex and the way it applies to film, and then I'll have you talk about it in your discussion as well. So the term white savior industrial complex was coined by novelist Teju Cole, who is a Nigerian-American writer, who used the white savior industrial complex to refer to the confluence of practices, processes, and institutions that reify historical inequities to validate systems of white privilege. And what he was talking about, or what he was meaning with regard to this, was that historically and in present day, white folks are often rewarded from saving, metaphorically and in practice, those less fortunate, and in doing so are able to completely disregard the policies that they have supported and created and maintained systems of oppression. So Cole was largely speaking about the systems in Haiti, where Americans had gone in, destabilized the regime, created large amounts of poverty, and then after the earthquake, gone in, did a few things to try and fix it, and then held themselves up by saying, "Look how great we are! Look at what a wonderful job we're doing." And I think there are a lot of parallels here to Atticus, which makes me sad when I say that. But the idea that Atticus is held up as this beacon, really the savior of Tom Robinson, that he's a hero because he tries, with like Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. I don't think trying's enough, particularly when he's clearly benefited from systems of white privilege. Calpurnia, his housekeeper and maid, is a black woman, and the fact that he treats her nicely, as opposed to some of the other people in town treating her poorly, is not the end of his responsibility. He should be fighting for her to be able to employ somebody, or letting her keep her own house, for goodness sake. So I struggle with Atticus and the white savior complex. But I'm looking forward to hearing your views. Maybe you can sway me otherwise. And I hope you had a great week. I hope you stayed warm. Looking forward to talking to you soon. Take care.